welcome to the Labor Force Podcast. Stories of the working class in a time of renewed labor militancy and awareness that capitalism is a rotten deal. I'm your host, Mike Strugan, proud member of New York State United Teachers. Many tributes coming in for the Reverend Jesse Jackson's passing. One of the more poignant labor-focused ones I found came from April Verrett, president of SEIU, who said the following. Growing up on the south side of Chicago, Reverend Jesse Jackson was real to us. He wasn't just someone we heard about. He showed up in our neighborhoods, our churches, our marches, and in the way our parents talked about dignity and justice at the dinner table. He showed us what moral courage looks like when it's lived out loud, with love for people and faith in what we can build together. As president of SEIU, I lead a union of workers who care for our elders, heal our communities, educate our children, and keep our cities running. Reverend Jackson always stood with and for working people, and for the future of unions. He understood that there is no civil rights movement without workers' rights, and no economic justice without strong unions. Through the Rainbow Push Coalition, he showed us how to bring together workers, faith leaders, civil rights organizers, immigrants, and everyday people into one broad, beautiful coalition rooted in justice. He reminded us that our differences are not our weakness. They're our strength when we choose to stand together. His historic runs for president changed the story of what leadership in America could look like. They widened the circle of who gets to be seen, who gets to be heard, and who gets to dream big enough to claim the highest offices in the land. Because of Reverend Jackson, generations of Black leaders found the courage to step forward, and in doing so, helped this country see itself more clearly. At a time when it feels easier to tear one another down than to stay in the work of building together, Reverend Jackson's life offers us a better way. He reminds us that we're bound together, that none of us gets free alone, that the work of justice is not about who gets the credit, but about who gets lifted. As we mourn his passing with heavy hearts and deep gratitude, we honor Reverend Jesse Jackson by carrying forward the love he showed for our people, the coalitions he built across difference, and the belief he never gave up on, that if we walk this road together, we can bend this country closer to justice. All right, we have a labor wave that's really reshaping what work looks like in hospitals, auto plants, and even legal brothels. I know that sounds like a wild mix, but stick with me, it all connects. Let's start out west with Kaiser Permanente. As of this recording, thousands of healthcare workers at Kaiser are still on strike. This is an open-ended walkout that's now into its fourth week. More than 31,000 employees are out, including about 22,000 nurses in Southern California, and they're on the picket lines demanding better pay and staffing conditions. This isn't some symbolic thing. It's actively disrupting patient appointments, surgeries, and treatments across California and Hawaii. The strike kicked off January 26th, and is led by the United Nurses Associations of California Union of Healthcare Professionals, an umbrella union that covers nurses, physical therapists, midwives, and other health workers. The core accusation is that Kaiser's been violating staffing agreements and worsening patient care. Kaiser, of course, denies those allegations. They're basically saying, no, we're not breaking the rules, and we're not cutting corners on care. But the workers don't buy that, and that's what's fueling this really long, open-ended walkout. On wages, the gap is actually pretty clear. The union's demanding a 25% raise over 4 years. They argue they need that just to retain and recruit staff after years of inflation and burnout, especially in the post-COVID era. Kaiser's counter is a 21.5% increase over 4 years. Kaiser says its employees are, on average, the highest paid among other healthcare organizations, and they keep coming back to this line about balancing fair competitive pay with protecting access and affordability for patients and members. So they're basically saying, we're not cheap, but we can't blow up premiums and costs. Underneath those numbers, you've got a deeper tension. You've got workers who've just come through COVID, dealing with burnout, short staffing, and higher patient loads. You've got inflation since the last round of contracts, making take-home pay feel smaller, even when the number on the paycheck goes up a little. And then you've got Kaiser, a giant health system with significant resources, arguing that if wages go up too far, healthcare becomes less affordable. So it turns into this clash over who should absorb the pressure, the workers through their pay and working conditions, or the system through its reserves and revenue. Negotiations have resumed after a stalemate, but the word right now is that no agreement appears imminent. So patients are caught in the middle, scrambling to reschedule care, worrying about delays, while both sides say their position is ultimately about protecting patients. Now contrast that with what just happened at NewYork-Presbyterian. Thousands of nurses there with the New York State Nurses Association, about 4,200 members, have reached a tentative agreement after what the union calls a historic month-and-a-half-long strike. They went out on January 12th alongside nurses at other hospitals in the city. Most of those other nurses have already ratified their deals and gone back to work, but NYP nurses held the line longer through some of the harshest winter weather the city's seen in years, and that pressure delivered a very different outcome. The tentative agreement they got includes improved enforceable safe staffing standards and an actual increase in the number of nurses. That's not just "we promise to try harder." It's language the union says they can enforce. They also want protections against workplace violence, which is a huge issue in healthcare, and safeguards around AI, meaning there are guardrails on how AI tools get used in the hospital. On top of that, you've got salary increases of more than 12% over 3 years, with nurses keeping their health benefits without extra out-of-pocket costs. NewYork-Presbyterian, for its part, says it's pleased with the tentative settlement and calls it a reflection of their tremendous respect for nurses. So if Kaiser's an example of a system still fighting hard over the limits of pay and staffing, NewYork-Presbyterian is starting to look like the emerging standard. Raises in the double digits, enforceable safe staffing language, AI and violence protections all baked into the contract. The question now is whether Kaiser nurses, and really hospital workers across the country, decide that's the bar they're going to aim for. Let's switch gears, literally, and head down to Tennessee. In Chattanooga, workers at the Volkswagen assembly plant just pulled off something that's been out of reach for years. They overwhelmingly approved their first contract with the UAW. This is a big symbolic crack in the southern wall. What makes this so striking is the backstory, of course. VW workers there actually voted against unionizing twice before. But in 2024, they finally voted to join the UAW, and that kicked off nearly 2 years of organizing and bargaining that led to the deal they just ratified. After negotiating through early February, the workers voted on a tentative agreement, and 96% said yes. That's not a squeaker, that's a blowout. UAW President Shawn Fain went down there and told workers, "Today you showed the world Southern auto workers are ready to fight." And then he used that moment to talk directly to the rest of the region's non-union workforce. "Come on in, the water's fine." You can tell the union sees this as a beachhead, not just a one-off win. Let's talk about what's actually in the contract, because that's what other workers are going to judge. There's an immediate $6,550 bonus. That's money in people's pockets right away. Over the life of the agreement, you got a 20% wage increase, which is a pretty serious bump, especially for a first contract. Healthcare premiums go down. Workers also get additional days off, which is a quality of life thing that people really feel. And then there's job security language. Volkswagen has to hold discussions with the union before any layoffs. That doesn't mean layoffs can never happen, but it does mean workers have a structured voice before those decisions get made. VW, for its part, is framing all of this as recognition of the hard work and dedication of its team members. To understand why this matters so much, you have to zoom out a bit. The southern auto landscape is dominated by foreign-owned plants, Volkswagen, Hyundai, and so on. And these facilities have often gotten big state subsidies to set up shop. Many of these states have right-to-work laws on the books, which make it harder for unions to build stable membership and funding. For decades, that's been part of the formula. Attract investment, keep labor costs predictable, and keep unions out. You're already seeing signs that non-union companies in the South are reacting to the new organizing push. Firms like Hyundai have moved to raise wages preemptively, in part to make the union pitch less attractive. So there's this sort of arms race. Unions are trying to show what's possible in terms of raises and protections, and employers are trying to match just enough to convince people they don't need a union. The Chattanooga win massively strengthens the UAW's talking points when they go to the other plants and say, "Look, this isn't hypothetical. Here's the bonus. Here's the 20% raise. Here's the language on layoffs." That's powerful. But, and this is important, it doesn't mean union growth in the South is automatic now. You've still got very aggressive anti-union politics in a lot of these states. There's uncertainty around the EV market, how fast it grows, where new plants get built, what happens if demand slows, and that can spook people about job security and about rocking the boat. And organizers have had setbacks in the region too. Not every campaign gets to the finish line or wins that first election. So Chattanooga is a breakthrough, but it's not the end of the story. It's more like proof of concept. The Southern auto workers can win a serious contract if they're willing to take the risk and organize. Now for the third front in this labor moment, and it's one a lot of people probably didn't see coming. Union organizing at a legal brothel. Out in Pahrump, Nevada, at Sheri's Ranch, one of the state's oldest legal brothels. Sex workers are trying to form what could become the first union for sex workers in the country. A majority of the brothel's 74 workers have filed a petition to unionize under the name United Brothel Workers. They're working with the Communications Workers of America, which is interesting in itself. You've got a mainstream union partnering with workers in a very stigmatized industry. What pushed them into action was a controversial independent contractor agreement. Under that deal, the brothel would be allowed to use workers' likenesses without permission, even after they leave. One worker gave this very vivid example. This is how you end up the face of a Japanese lubricant company without ever having signed a document. You can hear the worry there. It's about long-term control of your image and your content. In a world where once something is online, it's basically out there forever. And with AI tools now able to generate or manipulate images, that kind of open-ended likeness use starts to really feel dangerous. Legally, Nevada is the only state where people can buy sex at licensed brothels in certain rural counties. At Sheri's, the workers are officially classified as independent contractors, but the workers argue they're treated like employees. They talk about set schedules, minimum pricing, and other controls that the brothel imposes. They say they want the same basic things every other worker wants: a safe and respectful workplace. Union advocates are making the point that all workers are guaranteed certain human decencies and dignities, and that the right to organize is one of those. Management at Sheri's Ranch, for its part, is saying it respects workers' rights to express their views on workplace structure, so at least publicly, they're not going scorched earth, but the big question's still unresolved. And again, one of the key issues in the process is whether these workers are legally considered employees or contractors. That classification affects whether they can actually secure formal protections and negotiate a contract. The process itself could take weeks and probably longer in practice as the legal arguments play out. Meanwhile, the workers are operating under that cloud of uncertainty. How much control does the brothel have over their time, their pricing, and their images? And what recourse do they have if they disagree? So if you zoom out across all three stories, Kaiser and NewYork-Presbyterian, Volkswagen Chattanooga, and Sheri's Ranch, you start to see some common threads. Workers in very different industries are fighting over some of the same things: basic staffing and safety, real control over their schedules and their jobs, and a say in how new technologies, especially AI, get used on them and around them. Nurses are pushing for enforceable staffing ratios and AI safeguards so tech doesn't quietly replace their judgment. Auto workers are using collective power to lock in wage gains and job security language in a turbulent industry. And sex workers are trying to protect their images and their futures in a digital world where a likeness can be copied, remixed, and monetized forever. All that puts a lot of pressure on labor law that was written for a different era, when the big question was mostly factory floors and office hierarchies, not algorithmic scheduling or AI-generated content. So these fights are kind of stress testing the system in real time. Now let's talk about something that's got a lot of office workers spooked. The idea that there's a new class war being waged on so-called white-collar or laptop workers, driven by tech billionaires and turbocharged by AI. You might have seen the viral thread from Chris Hayes, where he said the goal of today's tech oligarchs is, quote, to do to white-collar workers what globalization and neoliberalism did to blue-collar workers. You hear that? And if you're a software engineer, a content strategist, or a mid-level manager in 2026, your stomach drops a little. It sounds like the bottom is about to fall out from under you. And look, the anxiety is coming from somewhere real. The newest jobs data is ugly. According to the latest ADP employment report, white-collar job growth hasn't just slowed down, it's going backward. Private employers added something like 22,000 jobs in January 2026, but the professional services sector alone lost roughly 57,000 positions. That's not a blip, that's a contraction. Zoom out a bit. U.S. employers announced over 108,000 job cuts at the very start of the year, the worst January since the Great Recession in 2009. Layoffs are up more than 100% over last year, and more than 200% compared to the end of 2025. A big chunk of that bloodletting was white-collar workers. A lot of the classic good jobs people were told to chase with degrees and credentials. And the usual suspects are leading the charge. Amazon has been chopping away at its corporate workforce, eliminating around 16,000 corporate jobs in January alone as part of a plan to get rid of something like 30,000 white-collar roles. Meta has kept swinging the axe too, especially in its Reality Labs division and related teams, with hundreds of positions cut in early 2026. So if you're in that world, it's easy to plug this into the culture war storyline. You see Trump and the new right railing against credentialed elites, going after universities, civil servants, NGOs, and you figure, okay, there's a coordinated political project to punish liberal, college-educated workers. In Trump's second term, he really did go at those institutions. We've seen attacks on universities, on scientists, on federal agencies. They even set up this so-called Department of Government Efficiency that functioned as a slash-and-burn operation on public sector professionals. The White House basically went on a vengeance tour through liberal strongholds. But although those political attacks are serious, they're still limited. They target specific pockets of the professional class: academics, civil servants, bureaucrats. What's happening right now across the broader white-collar labor market is bigger, more diffuse, and much more familiar if you've been paying attention to what's happened to blue-collar workers over the last 40 or 50 years. There's a really important point here. There isn't some secret central committee of billionaires sitting around a table plotting a bespoke class war on office workers. What we're seeing is capitalism doing exactly what it's designed to do, cutting labor costs whenever the opportunity appears, and using new technology as the knife. By the end of 2025, companies were already citing AI as a contributing factor in nearly 55,000 U.S. layoffs, according to figures from Challenger, Gray, and Christmas. That's not science fiction. That's actual people's jobs. Salesforce CEO Mark Benioff was pretty blunt. They shed around 4,000 customer support workers because AI tools had taken over about half of the workload. Technical capacity translated directly into payroll cuts. So when we look at these mass layoffs, we can tell the easy story, that this is some new war on the laptop class. Or we can tell the more uncomfortable truth. This is the same old story of capital chasing profits by squeezing labor. It's just that, for the first time in a long time, a critical mass of white-collar workers are starting to feel it in their own paychecks, instead of reading about it happening to steelworkers or warehouse pickers. Next, I want to dig into how AI is being used as a tool to de-skill and discipline the professional class, and then what it would actually look like to build solidarity between office workers and the rest of the working class, instead of pitting us against each other. Let's start with how AI changes the calculus for employers. For decades, the professional managerial class, the folks with degrees, specialized skills, and an alphabet soup of credentials, were told that if they just stayed on the treadmill, they'd be safe. Maybe not rich, but certainly insulated from the kind of brutal precarity that blue-collar workers faced. You get the right degree, learn the right jargon, master the right software, and you're supposed to have a seat at the table, or at least a guaranteed spot in the waiting room. That was the deal, and now that deal is cracking. AI gives bosses a new way to break it. If corporations can reach a level of good enough with AI, good enough to draft code, good enough to spit out a basic report, good enough to moderate a stream of content or tweak a logistics schedule, then suddenly they start asking a very simple question. Why are we paying a human $120,000 a year to do something a machine can do, or at least make faster and cheaper? That logic is showing up in middle management, in programming teams, in marketing and communications. The tasks that used to justify whole layers of staff are being partially automated, and that becomes a pretext to shrink headcount. You don't need to hate white-collar workers to do this. You just need a spreadsheet and a quarterly earnings target. And this is where Marx still helps us make sense of it. In Capital, he talks about how machinery and automation are deployed not to lighten the burden of work out of some humanitarian impulse, but to deepen capital's control over labor. The point is to get the same or greater output with fewer workers, and to swap out skilled workers for less skilled ones wherever possible. He describes how the constant aim of these technological improvements is to diminish the amount of human labor needed for a given chunk of capital, so that fewer workers are required and higher skilled workers can be replaced by cheaper, lower skilled workers. In other words, technology isn't neutral. Under capitalism, it shows up wearing the boss's jersey. What AI does is extend that logic into domains that used to feel pretty insulated: the creative, the analytical, the bureaucratic. A lot of people in those roles are now being what can be called proletarianized. Their work is being chopped into smaller, more routine tasks that can be automated or standardized. Their autonomy shrinks. Their skills get baked into the training data for some large language model that can now mimic what they do at scale. Think about a copywriter whose years of work to help train an AI can now pump out serviceable ad copy in seconds. Or a junior programmer whose code becomes part of the giant pile that code-generating tools draw from. The individual's expertise is depersonalized. It becomes a generic input into a machine that management owns and controls. Meanwhile, the survivors, the people who keep their jobs, are often being housebroken. They're told to integrate AI tools into their workflow to boost productivity, which usually means doing more with less staff. They're monitored more closely. Their discretion over how the work gets done erodes. You go from being a professional with some control over your craft to a kind of glorified machine operator supervising a stack of algorithms. And I want to underline something here. This isn't happening because Trump signed some executive order. The bosses in Silicon Valley or on Wall Street don't need permission from any politician to roll out automation and lay people off. They answer to shareholders and profit expectations. That's all the political cover they need. We've seen this collision between tech and employment coming for a long time. Back in 2013, that Oxford study famously estimated that nearly half of existing professions were at risk of automation over the next couple of decades. During the 2019 presidential race, Andrew Yang tried to sound the alarm about what he called the fourth industrial revolution of robotics and AI. And a few years ago, we already had warnings that AI wasn't some distant threat for white-collar workers, it was an immediate one. So today's wave of layoffs and restructuring isn't a sudden betrayal of the professional class. It's the system following through on a trajectory that's been visible for years. What's changing is that the myth of safety for the credentialed class is collapsing. People who thought of themselves as apart from the working class are realizing they're in it. They just had a nicer cubicle. And that realization is actually where some political possibility cracks open. If white-collar workers begin to see that their enemy isn't the warehouse worker or the barista or the factory hand, but the same profit-driven logic that's been gutting these jobs for decades, then there's a chance to build real solidarity instead of scrambling to protect a shrinking set of elite perches. So if this isn't a unique, targeted class war on white-collar workers, but rather capitalism doing what it does with a new set of tools, the question becomes, what do we do with that insight? One option is the path we're already seeing in a lot of media takes: panic on behalf of the professional managerial class. The story goes, the people who did everything right, they got the degrees, they did the internships, they moved to the expensive coastal cities, are now under attack. We have to rescue the laptop class. That frame centers the professionals and treats everyone else as background. But there's another, better option. Treat this moment as a chance to build cross-class solidarity. Instead of saying, now it's happening to us, so it's finally serious, you say, now we're feeling what working-class people have lived with for decades, and that means we have common interests. That would mean office workers, coders, designers, project managers, recognizing that their fate is tied up with warehouse workers, call center workers, nurses, and public school teachers. Everyone whose labor can be chopped up and squeezed by AI and other forms of automation. In other words, most of us. What does that solidarity look like in practice? At the most basic level, it looks like organizing. We've already seen early attempts at tech worker unionization at Google, Kickstarter, and games and digital media. Those efforts often stall or get crushed, but they're important because they crack the illusion that white-collar workers are above collective struggle. Imagine a world where software engineers, content moderators, and product managers are in unions that bargain not just over wages and benefits, but over how AI is deployed in the workplace. Who gets displaced? Who gets retrained? What kind of severance and support is guaranteed when tasks are automated? That kind of bargaining could line up with what factory workers and public sector workers are already demanding around automation and staffing levels. Beyond the shop floor, solidarity looks like shared political demands. Instead of retreating into a defensive posture, save our white-collar jobs. We can fight for robust social safety nets that protect everybody, stronger unemployment insurance, universal health care, real retraining programs that aren't just marketing slogans. It also means pushing for public investment in work that markets don't value, but society desperately needs. Climate resilience projects, elder care, child care, public health infrastructure. If AI and automation really are going to allow us to produce more with less human labor, then the logical response from a humane society would be to shorten working hours, raise standards, and redirect people into socially necessary work, not just toss them aside because they're redundant. And then there's the question of who decides how AI gets rolled out. Right now, those decisions are made in boardrooms and C-suites, with input from investors and consultants. Democratic control over transformative technologies would mean bringing workers and the public into that decision-making process, through regulation, through public ownership in some sectors, and through strong unions that can actually say no to destructive uses of technology. The opening here isn't to anoint the professional class as a uniquely besieged victim, but to build solidarity across the entire working class and fight for collective solutions. If office workers who grew up believing they were safely middle class start to see themselves as workers with shared interests, then the politics we can imagine gets much bigger. Now, I know that's easier said than done. The ideology of meritocracy runs deep. A lot of people who are getting squeezed right now are still holding on to the belief that if they just reskill hard enough or become AI fluent, they'll outrun the wave. And yeah, learning new tools matters, but individual adaptation has limits when the underlying logic is to make more money with fewer people. So if you're listening to this as a white-collar worker worried about AI, here's my pitch. Don't just ask, how do I protect my job? Ask, how do I stand with other workers so none of us are disposable? Talk to your coworkers about what's happening. Pay attention to union drives in your industry. Support strikes and campaigns in other sectors, because the same forces that are coming for your job have been hammering theirs for a longer time. And if you're a blue-collar worker hearing about office layoffs and thinking, welcome to the party, you're not wrong. But there's power in having more people at that party, especially if they're finally willing to admit they're on your side of the class line. We don't have to accept a future where AI under capitalism just means a smaller core of overworked survivors and a growing mass of people discarded as unnecessary. With organization, with political pressure, with a clear sense of who our real opponents are, we can demand something better. Shorter hours, better conditions, and democratic say over how these technologies shape our lives. So we'll keep tracking how AI, work, and class power collide in the months ahead, because they surely will. To bring this all home, what we're witnessing right now, from hospital picket lines to auto plants in the South to a legal brothel in Nevada to corporate offices rattled by AI, isn't a series of disconnected headlines. It's one story. It's the story of who gets to control work in the 21st century. At Kaiser, nurses are saying patient care can't be balanced on spreadsheets. In New York, nurses prove that when workers hold the line, they can force real enforceable standards. In Chattanooga, auto workers show that even in the heart of the anti-union South, collective action can crack the wall. And at Sheri's ranch, sex workers are asserting something fundamental, that dignity, safety, and control over your own labor and likeness aren't luxuries, they're rights. Meanwhile, white-collar workers are learning a hard lesson that blue-collar workers have known for decades. No credential, no degree, no salary band makes you immune from a system that prioritizes profit over people. AI isn't a villain on its own. Under Democratic control, it can reduce drudgery and shorten the work week. But under shareholder control, it becomes another tool to cut payroll and concentrate power. So the dividing line isn't nurses versus patients, or blue-collar versus white-collar, or even humans versus machines. The dividing line is between those who sell their labor and those who control the terms under which that labor is used. The choice in front of us is simple, even if the path isn't. Fragmentation or solidarity, panic or organization, competing for fewer seats at the table, or building a bigger table and demanding a say in how it's run. If this moment feels unstable, that's because it is. Old assumptions about job security, professionalism, and safe careers are collapsing. But instability cuts both ways. It creates risk and it creates opportunity. The real question isn't whether AI, automation, and restructuring will reshape work. They already are. The real question is who shapes the reshaping. And that's going to depend on whether more of us decide that we're not isolated professionals, not niche workers in niche industries, but part of the same working class, facing the same logic with the same potential power when we act together. Well, that does it for this episode. If you like what you hear, give a rate or review on your favorite podcast app to help me grow. I'm proud to be part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network, with over 200 labor shows you can check out at laborradionetwork.org. This has been the Labor Force Podcast. I'm Mike Strukin. Solidarity, always.